There are few things that I'm truly passionate about nowadays. But one of those passions is hip-hop, obviously. I mean, if you've been around the channel for a moment, then you know it's about all things hip-hop and hip-hop adjacent. But another one of my passions is gaming. And if you've been around the channel for a while, then you may have picked up video game references that I sprinkled in here and there. An interesting thing about the hip-hop and gaming industries is that their rises to undeniable popularity almost directly parallel one another. Not saying that they happened at the exact same time or that one had anything to do with the other. We all know those are vastly different stories. But it's more so the fact that rap was considered a fad that would die out like disco sometime in the 80s, and that the gaming industry was also given a death sentence when the market literally crashed in '83. Then both began to surge through the mid-'80s to early '90s, one thanks to their golden age of artists and the other thanks to a plumber who curb stomps on turtles, and the rest as we know it is history. So when exactly did things begin to intersect between the two? Well, hip-hop had gotten so viable in pop culture that it was being used in TV shows, commercials, and ad campaigns. An example being this ad for The Legend of Zelda in 1986.
An entertainment system. It's The Legend of Zelda and it's really rad. Those creatures from Ganon are pretty bad. Octoroks, Tektites, Levers too. But with your help, our hero pulls through.
And of course this Super Mario Bros. Super Show intro.
The Mario Brothers and plumbing's a game. We're not like the others who get all the fame. If you're sick as in trouble.
They did a really nice callback to this in the Mario Brothers movie that recently dropped. But it was inevitable that rappers would start dropping bars referencing video games as well. And one of the most noteworthy examples came in 1988 when the Fresh Prince rapped for almost 6 minutes about being addicted to video games in a song called Human Video Game. And although not necessarily on this level, rappers have consistently shown love to video games since then. Whether it was Obi Trice mentioning Zelda, Lupe Fiasco and Lady of Rage dropping Street Fighter lines, The Game and Currency talking about their PlayStations, or Biggie making this iconic reference.
Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis. When I was dead broke, man, I couldn't picture this.
As a kid, that line stuck out to me because while I may not have been able to relate to everything that Biggie was saying at the time, I knew that having a Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis had to be peak living. But the popularity of hip-hop eventually had the media slotting in more urban references to appeal to younger crowds. Suddenly, every show needed their Poochie the Dog character, every commercial needed someone wearing a gold chain, and till this day, a lot of it can be pretty cringy. Not all of it, but just the productions that make it so obvious that it's a pandering job created by people who don't know the first thing about hip-hop, so they add a bunch of yo-yo-yo and generic record scratches and stuff like that.
Yo, man, this gonna be so cool, man. We're gonna be bumping, man, trying to help the boys out. You know how we do it. You feel me, dog?
It can be effective sometimes, but other times it's just nasty work. That aside, video games would be no different in that regard. We'd eventually get to a point where entire games will be themed around hip-hop or rappers in general. One of my personal favorites, Parappa the Rapper, is often credited for being hip-hop's first game, but that isn't entirely true. That honor would have to go to Toe Jam and Earl for the Sega Genesis. Releasing in 1991, Toe Jam and Earl was an action/roguelike game, one of the earliest roguelikes might I add, about two alien rappers from the planet Funkatron who accidentally crash-landed on some twisted version of our planet. They're just trying to find parts of their ship so they can repair it and leave, and there's really not much else to it. The game is very random and very laid back, anyone can pick it up and play, and that was by design. I understand that labeling it hip-hop's first game may be a bit of a reach, but look, they were rappers, they rapped everything in the manual, and if you had a subscription to Sega Visions magazine, you were able to buy the Toe Jam and Earl rap cassette tape, so you actually did have a chance to hear them on a track, and it was performed by series creator Greg Johnson. And although he may not look it, he was raised by a black father and a Russian mother, and was really big on groups like the Daz Band and Parliament, groups who would go on to be sampling gold mines for rappers. So being a fan of rap while it was coming around gave him the idea to make a game that kinda had a Fresh Prince aesthetic. Fun fact, there was once a point where Toe Jam and Earl were gonna be the mascots for Sega because they pretty much embodied the theme that Sega wanted at that time during their war with Nintendo. They were more modern, more edgy, something that the kids would think was cool and teenagers would be able to take seriously, but halfway during the development for this, Sonic appeared and quite literally swept the rug from underneath them. But even still, this game went on to become a cult classic and spawned a couple of sequels and eventually a reboot that came several years ago, and now apparently Steph Curry is reportedly funding the Toe Jam and Earl movie. Well, at least that's what was reported last December, so if you know anything about where that stands, let me know in the comments below. Now, if you asked me about a game that felt hip-hop when I was a kid, I would have undoubtedly said Streets of Rage. And I know the soundtrack is more electric dance music, house music, techno and whatnot, but some of those beats have hip-hop written all over them and I don't care what anybody says. But what about the first time a video game literally featured rappers as playable characters? There were a lot of games that had generic rap beats on the title screens that sounded something like this. But none of these games had actual rappers in them. I suppose we could technically consider any game that had Shaq in it, like NBA Showdown or Shaq Fu, but for the sake of brevity, I'm gonna go ahead and take a look at those whose rapper occupation actually came first. And that ironically brings us to a basketball game. 1995's Rap Jam Volume 1, which implies that this was supposed to have follow-ups. And this was published by Motown Software, a studio that is only credited for this and the Bebe's Kid game, and with a track record like that, I'm not surprised they shut down. Nah, I'm sorry, that was mean. But yeah, this game was fucking awful. One of those games that probably sounded cooler when coming up with the idea but failed in execution. The game featured the likes of Queen Latifah, Coolio, Warren G, Yo-Yo, and more, and none of them even remotely resembled themselves in game. This is not Queen Latifah. But this game is essentially an NBA Jam clone, and there were quite a few of those sprouting up at the time, but none of them really captured the fun that NBA Jam produced. And this one in particular was centered around rappers and didn't even have music playing during the actual gameplay. Just take a moment to think about some of the games we got in 1995. I mean, there was Donkey Kong Country 2, Chrono Trigger, Yoshi's Island, Street Fighter Alpha, just to name a few. So game quality was starting to increase, but this one was looking like it could have come out in 1989. And I know it may have been a smaller studio, I get it, but it just really seemed like this was nothing more than a cash grab and not an actual attempt to produce a good game. Honestly, if I was gonna play an NBA Jam clone at that time, I would have much rather gone with Looney Tunes B-Ball. I mean, that one's the same thing, but just with significantly more polish, kind of a hidden gem. But let's get back to Parappa the Rapper for a second. Earlier I said it wasn't the first video game with a hip-hop theme, but the distinction it does have is so much greater, and that's because it's credited as the first rhythm game. That's right, that's the genre that gave the world Dance Dance Revolution, Guitar Hero, Rock Band, DJ Hero, and more. That all spawned from a two-dimensional dog who rapped his way through his daily adventures, and this game also holds a special place in my heart personally because it was the first game that my family kinda bonded over. You know, my dad was an OG Miss Pac-Man and Galaga player, but he wasn't really up on the modern stuff at the time, and my mom was one of those people who looked at you playing video games as the equivalent to having a drug addiction. Like, she would literally walk by my room and see me playing Sonic and call me an addict. Like, I'm like, bro, I'm really just trying to get these Chaos Emeralds. I'm not bothering nobody. But anyway, so one random day, I started the demo for Parappa up in the living room, and yeah, I only had the demo until I was older. Shout out to Pizza Hut for hooking me up. 90s babies, y'all know what I'm talking about. But anyway, I'm not sure why, but I was never able to clear the onion stage, and I think that's just because I didn't have rhythm back when I was 7, and I mean, I barely have it now, but for whatever reason, my parents were just in the living room watching me play, and when they heard that level and Master Chop Chop started rapping, they both just started vibing. And I guess it was them behind me grooving and cheering me on that led to me beating that stage for the first time. So, you know, that's a moment that I never forgot. And also, it was one of the first examples I saw of how music can bring people together, even if it's in a video game. So I just thought I'd share that, but let me get back on track. So, at this point in the 90s, we've officially had multiple games centered around hip-hop. Some were hidden gems, others were cult classics, and some were ass flakes. Eventually, the hip-hop influence would hit Japan and would result in the likes of Capcom taking interest in adapting hip-hop themes into some of their games. I remember my first time running into this particular game at a now defunct place called Funfair Arcade that was right down the street from my school. And I remember the very first time I went there was always a massive crowd around one arcade cabinet, and that cabinet was for Marvel vs. Capcom 2. So instead of waiting my turn in line, I just started to free roam around the venue, and one game happened to catch my ear before it caught my eye. I realized I was hearing rap music and I was eager to see what game had that type of soundtrack, and that game was Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. Honestly, it only made sense for Street Fighter, a game where two people can literally meet up in a crowded metropolitan area and swing on each other, to have a street-based theme. So Capcom paid a quick visit to Canada where they held auditions for this soundtrack, and they were able to find the voice and lyricist for Third Strike, a rapper by the name of Infinite, who was basically tasked with coming up with several songs in a very short time for the audition. He was ultimately chosen and went on to not only produce multiple songs for the soundtrack, but he was also the voice of the game, so the guy telling you to fight, the guy on the character select screen, so on and so forth. This game went on to introduce thousands if not millions of people who had no interest in rap before to the genre, and Infinite definitely deserves his flowers for his work. Even after the release of Street Fighter 6, I'd still say that Third Strike is my favorite in the series, and I'd be lying if I said the soundtrack didn't have anything to do with that. This is also a very similar direction that Sega went in for the Sonic Adventure series. So because Knuckles had locks, black people could already identify with him. And clearly Sonic Team was aware and went all in, first starting with this theme song in Sonic Adventure, which was performed by Marlon Saunders, and took it significantly further in Sonic Adventure 2, where his theme and also every stage of his featured bars from a rapper by the name of hunnid-p. This was the coolest shit at the time because we never really saw it done like this in an action-adventure platformer, and it didn't even feel out of place. I'm also willing to bet you know at least one hood nigga that knows all the words to Pumpkin Hill or Aquatic Mine. And suddenly things were feeling a little bit different. It no longer felt like hip-hop and gaming were two entities that crossed paths from time to time. It felt like they were officially intertwined. I mean, by 1999 we had a literal Wu-Tang game called Wu-Tang Shaolin Style, which was born from a canceled game called Thrill Kill. Shaolin Style was a PS1 fighting game featuring almost every Wu-Tang member and up to 4-player combat. It actually had a surprising amount of depth to it and even had a now rare Wu-Tang controller that you could get your hands on. I still need one for my collection. But speaking of Wu-Tang, if you haven't played TMNT Shredder's Revenge that came out last year, you gotta do that at some point. Whoever's idea it was to have Ghostface and Raekwon do Shredder's boss theme needs a raise. Easily one of the greatest boss themes of all time. But moving along. We eventually got to a point where rappers appearing in video games was common. They began appearing as guest characters in sports games, and examples include being able to unlock Q-Tip in Knockout Kings 2000, Fabulous in Fight Night Round 2, Nelly and the Saint Lunatics in NBA Street Volume 2, and the many appearances in 2K. I mean, we had Redman in 2K1, Kanye in the game in 2K10, Drake, Bow Wow, and Snoop in 2K11. I could literally go on all day with these examples. I mean, people think Snoop Dogg is doing side quests now, but he was literally able to do side quests as an unlockable character in True Crime Streets of LA back in 2003. But let's take another quick look at a series that Snoop was a part of. You know it, you probably love it, and it's also a series that I think I might do a full and detailed retrospective on if you guys would be interested in that. It's of course the Def Jam series. Now we talked about Def Jam Icon on this channel a long time ago, but it wasn't for positive reasons. The first game in the series was 2003's Def Jam Vendetta, and when this game came out it felt like a fever dream, because who thought of having rappers wrestle? It was so over the top, so unexpected, and it was fucking dope. I miss when games weren't afraid to be this imaginative. It made me wish that instead of Rap Jam Volume 1, that they just did Rap Combat or a Rapper Street Fighter type of thing back in the 90s. But Def Jam Vendetta was a product of Aki Corporation, now known as Sin Sophia, and also who was best known at the time for WWF No Mercy and WrestleMania 2000. And it was also published by EA Big, which was a subsidiary of EA, which was more focused on casual and arcade style games. But anyway, it was dope. Vendetta featured over a dozen real-world rappers like Ludacris, DMX, Nori, Dub C, Scarface, and more. And there was also a plethora of original characters too, which brought the total character count to 46. For the story, you basically just chose one of 4 characters, each with different styles and backstories, and then from there you pretty much went to fill in for a friend who has to fight to pay off a debt. Eventually you rise through the ranks, get street cred and notoriety, and beat the piss out of actual rappers on the way. You get girlfriends, and then you work your way up for a clash with D-Mob, aka Kratos, to wrap up the main story and set up the sequel. Now, despite the amount of options we have for wrestling games at this time, Vendetta took that formula and warped it in such a unique way that it felt completely fresh and innovative. But it would end up being left in the dust by its sequel, a game that needs no introduction, and a game that is still played competitively till this day. That game is Def Jam Fight for New York. Truly a game that almost everyone knows about, even if they haven't played it. Fight for New York took everything from the original game and cranked it up 1,000 times over. You got to create your character, there were more rappers, the roster went up to 67, the stages and set pieces were crazier, the moves were more devastating, and Snoop Dogg, or Crow, is the big boss this time. There's just so much to say about this in Vendetta, to be honest, so if you do want that retrospective, let me know. Oh, yeah, my bad. And then there's Icon. Alright, let's move on. So if rappers can be wrestlers, they can be action heroes too, right? Well, that's what Genuine Games and Vivendi asked when they cranked out 50 Cent Bulletproof. Genuine Games involve people who worked on Ratchet & Clank and Knockout King, so yeah, that's a pretty decent yet vastly different repertoire. And this was late 2005, so 50 Cent was only a couple weeks removed from the Get Rich or Die Trying movie. He was surging, and this was a great attempt to capitalize on it, and capitalize they did. In this game, 50 and G-Unit are pretty much like a ghetto task force, and Lloyd Banks and Yayo have the ability to pick locks in certain missions. You control Curtis and your allies are pretty much immortal, but other than that, this is just a third-person action shooter, and the story, honestly, it doesn't even matter. You're playing as 50 Cent and murdering hordes of goons, like what more do you want? The game itself wasn't great, but it honestly had some fun moments and ideas. Plus, it was 50 Cent, a legit superstar. People in 2023 who were shocked to know he was still touring and selling out venues across the country have simply forgotten how big of a star he was for my generation. So this game ended up selling well over 1 million copies. Obviously it got a sequel, but the sequel known as 50 Cent Blood on the Sand was kind of in development hell for a minute. It started out as a Tom Clancy game, but the publisher didn't own the rights to use the name Tom Clancy, so it was scrapped. It was eventually rewritten and made into a spiritual successor to Bulletproof. The game was reviewed slightly better than Bulletproof, but unfortunately people weren't really too enthusiastic about a 50 Cent themed game in 2009. By then, most people were playing games like Assassin's Creed 2, Modern Warfare 2, and Arkham Asylum. The game sold less than 60,000 copies, which made it a failure in comparison to Bulletproof by far. But to be honest, I think it was pretty fun. It was fun running around a generic Middle East setting and just fucking shit up with G-Unit. On top of that, the graphics were really good and still kinda hold up till this day. With the exception of mobile games, Blood on the Sand would pretty much be the last time that a rapper had a lead role in their own game. So that begs the question, what rapper could you see being the main character in a game nowadays? It's pretty amazing when you think about how far all of this has come. I mean, now you can see Dr. Dre in Grand Theft Auto and not even be surprised. You've got rappers in Fortnite and rappers streaming Fortnite and other games. You've got Call of Duty celebrating 50 years of hip-hop and adding Nicki Minaj and 21 Savage to the roster. And I know a lot of people have mixed feelings about this and thought it was goofy, but honestly I saw it as a callback to some of the shit we grew up with. It's a game, why not be over the top? And in a lot of ways it gave me hope that we could possibly see a Def Jam type game again someday. I remember when Ice-T teased the idea of a new Def Jam game a couple years ago, and I felt like it would never happen because these rappers are too concerned with their social media representation and may not want people posting videos of their character models being violated. But I figured by now at least someone in the Mugen community would have made some kind of Marvel vs. Capcom type thing with rappers, so y'all get on that. But as you can see, there are enough examples to go on all day. I didn't even mention stuff like Def Jam Rap Star or Lil Wayne and Lil Jon being in Tony Hawk games. Games from the Midnight Club series are another example. GTA San Andreas put a lot of people on that early 90s West Coast gangster rap. We'd seriously be here going over this all day. But I'll wrap this up with something I mentioned earlier on in the video. Hip-hop and gaming did blow up around the same time, and when their paths crossed, they only served to benefit one another. Video games were able to bridge the gap between rap music and people who had no prior interest in it. There are a lot of game soundtracks that people just listen to casually for this reason. And rappers simply being willing to provide their likeness were able to carry some games into a level of popularity that they wouldn't have reached otherwise. While this may not mean much to people, I actually think it's pretty dope. But hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you made it this far, let me know what your favorite rap-related video game was or is, and what would you like to add to this discussion. Comment below and definitely subscribe to the channel if you haven't. I appreciate anyone who takes the time to listen to me ramble about these types of things. So yeah, hopefully y'all have a good day, and I'll catch y'all in the next one.